Fred, why?
Give it up some mood music.
Oh my gosh.
So today we are talking about war. All right. Now, our last class, we talked about capital punishment, and I can't believe it took that whole time to do that. But we did capital punishment, and I showed you the tension between Matthew 5 and Romans 13. And today I want to talk about war, and if I have time, I'll tie in civil disobedience with that. Once again, at least Norm Geisler is using Matthew 5 versus Romans 13. There's plenty of other text on both sides as well, but we'll go here. So that famous song from the Vietnam era war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Well, St. Augustine would beg to differ. And he's writing about the 4th century, late 300s, early 400s, moving into the 5th century. And Rome is, at least in the West, is on its demise as an empire, but Christianity is on the rise. And if you remember, in 380, Theodosius the Great declared Christianity the state religion. But within 30 years, Rome in 410 was sacked by the Vandals and the Goths for the first time in almost 1,000 years. And so the Romans are having this weird conflict in their head. Some of them are saying, see, this is what happens when we worship some pacifistic little shepherd boy god, and we've left like the gods of war of Rome. And we need to go back to the old ways and not this wimpy Christian religion. And Augustine, in his City of God, City of Man, rolled out this idea, not only introducing Platonism or syncretizing it with Christian thought, but he also gives an apologetic about why Rome fell. And he said, you proclaimed Christ with your mouth, but in your hearts you were far from him, and it was God's judgment upon you. And he also makes the distinction that Rome is not the eternal city. It's not the new Jerusalem, which many contemporaries at the time thought. Like Isaiah's prophecy, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God. And Rome was not the new Jerusalem. Rome was a human city built by human hands, and therefore could be destroyed by human hands. And the kingdom of heaven is unbuilt by human hands. It is an eternal and abiding city, and that is where our abode is. What happened, though, at 380, when it happened even earlier under Constantine the Great with the Edicts of Milan, where Christianity is declared the state, or is declared legal, and then in 380 the state religion, and actually non-Christians begin to be persecuted in the empire by Christians. And this is when just war theory comes about, because for the most part, the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the church was persecuted, it was underground, it was in a minority position. But with the coming of its being legalized and then nationalized, it gained wealth, power, privilege, status. And with those things, they became invested not in the kingdom of our God, the sweet by and by, but also in the here and now. And so we have Augustine rolling out this just war theory, because now, instead of Christians fleeing persecution or simply offering themselves up to the martyr's pyre, they began to fight for their rights and actually to impose their beliefs, their laws, their rules on even non-Christians. There's 2 parts to Augustine's just war theory. Firstly, it has to have a just cause, and he lists 2 just causes. The first is a war of defense, and this can go anywhere. This would also be the same justification, say someone, it's like forfeiture in natural law theory. This idea, if someone threatens your life, they forfeit their life. If someone So this could be at the home or individual level, all the way up to a national state level, where if someone is invading or wishing you ill, so it could even be the intentionality, right? If you find out that another country is about to launch thermonuclear warheads on you, you would be justified in a preemptive strike because their intention, kind of like the Sermon on the Mount, their thought is showing you what the actions are going to be that follows. So defense is a just cause. And secondly, intervention for those who can't defend themselves. And this was actually used in the Gulf War. People from the Southern Baptist Convention and other top Christian advisors to President Bush told him, because we're defending Kuwait from an aggressor, Iraq in this case, that they can't defend themselves against, it is just for us to intervene on Kuwait's behalf. Okay, so that was the just war rationale given by religious Christian leaders in the United States for Bush to go to war. Okay, so the first is it has to have a just cause. Secondly, it must be fought justly. So, for example, you're not to attack non-combatants, women and children. You're not to salt the fields. You're not to set fires to cities. You're not to chop down the fruit trees. You're not to use poison or biological warfare. This is way before the Geneva Convention, of course, but in essence, it's kind of like a 4th century version of the Geneva Convention, these kind of rules of warfare. So it has to have a just cause and it must be fought justly. Now, in theory, I love it. I agree with Augustine. My problem is in the practicality. And in the practicality, here's my question for you guys, and I'll change the screen if you want to jump in here and talk to me. With those two criteria, just cause, fought justly, can you give me any example of a just war since the time of Christ? And be happy to wait a moment. Just cause, fought justly.
I mean, wouldn't it be any defensive war from the side of the not the aggressor, but the person on the receiving end of aggression?
You mean like the southern states during the Civil War?
Maybe not that particular example.
Why not?
Well, just cause.
They were defending themselves from an invading army.
Wasn't there already a lot of conflicts preceding that? Yeah.
See, the North could also claim
tribes
Civil
that
War
were being conquered by the British Empire. I don't know,
innocent
man.
Zulus.
I don't know.
The Zulu Empire was brutal to what it did to its neighboring
but in that
tribes
particular
and kept them in a state. Right. But let me go back to the Civil War. See, the North could also claim they are doing an intervention for those who can't defend themselves, i.e. the slaves. The slaves can't free themselves. They need someone else to come in and do that for them. So we are fighting a just war, glory, glory, hallelujah, the battle hymn of the Republic. And at the same time, you had preachers in the South claiming God was on their side. And they were defending the godly South against the atheistic, industrial, pagan North. And you're just going, good Lord. And as you can well imagine, the Civil War was anything but civil. It was so horrific and bloody and brutal. There was a lot of honor and stuff involved in a lot of the battles, but a lot of treachery, a lot of deceit, even early forms of
industrial war as well, right?
Bio warfare. Yeah, the weaponry and everything else. It changed the face of war forever.
But
it's kind of a trick question. Go ahead, Valentina.
Yeah, I think like it was kind of a trick question because you would probably say there is not just such thing as just war. But if we consider the aspects of like,
Exactly.
attacking in order to not be attacked, like there is a lot of occasions where USA did that, like, in Vietnam or even like with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, like it was always like, oh, they expressed that they were gonna do worse, so we attacked them first. Or like with the Latin America, like, countries where they were obviously there were other reasons for USA to like invade those countries, but the excuse was always, oh, they're not strong enough to fight the British colonies, so we are gonna fight for them, things like that. But really, I thought the answer you wanted was there is no such thing as a just cause, just war, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them, maybe they have one aspect, like maybe there was a just cause, but unfortunately, when war actually doesn't entail so much horror and atrocity seems to be bred by it. And so those are Augustine's just war. And like I said, intellectually, theoretically, I like it. It's just when we look at the world and the wars that have taken place, even let's take the Gulf War, for example. Yeah, we could make a case from an American perspective that, hey, look, we're the good guys. We don't have a dog in this fight. We're trying to protect the little guy from the big guy. Well, first of all, we did have a dog in that fight, and the dog's name was oil. I mean, we're very invested in keeping the oil flow going to the west out of the Gulf. And in addition, if you know about the history of the Middle East, Kuwait is a relatively new country. I would have to Google to double check, but we're talking in the ballpark of post-World War II. Remember, Great Britain, with the Allies, had defeated the Ottoman Empire. This goes back to actually World War I. And that empire was divvied up. And Great Britain, along with others, either made colonies out of the Ottoman lands or they picked them up. They rewrote the map of the Middle East and made these different countries. I mean, it's part of why Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, looks so bizarre. It's almost like leftover pieces between Syria and the Saudis and the modern state of Israel, which once again was basically given to the Jews by the British, who were in control of that land at the time in 1948. Kuwait had historically and traditionally been part of what's modern day Iraq, part of that whole Persian, Iran, Iraq, the Fertile Crescent empire. And so historically, Iraq is seeing Kuwait as a parceled off piece of its territory that they're trying to reintegrate into the homeland. And so from their perspective, they could see it as a war of reunification over British imperialism, where from a modern perspective, we could see it as, no, it's an aggression of one oil state on another. And so perspective is huge and powerful. And that is the case in war, right? Go ahead.
Was it Baudrillard who wrote The Gulf War Did Not Take Place? The Gulf War did not take place. I think that was...
I don't know.
Jean Baudrillard. He was basically arguing that he wasn't saying the events of the Gulf War didn't literally take place, but he was saying that the perception of it as a just war from the American perspective was largely a result of the way that it was being presented through the media, very selective presentations of the campaigns, whereas from a Kuwait perspective, it was more a series of atrocities. I'm pretty sure it was Jean Baudrillard.
Very good. And so you could do this with so many things. My niece Freedom, knocking on 16, going on 30. I was helping with her virtual history assignment, and it was on Che Rivera. And if you're familiar with him, he actually started off as a medical student, but when he saw the oppression from American corporations and the residual of imperialism on Central and South America, he wanted to do something for the people. And so he went to Cuba to help Fidel overthrow the dictator there. And so some people saw Che as a freedom fighter, right? And they would take land from the rich and divvy it up amongst the poor. They built hospitals, education system. Bernie Sanders just got some flack about that, right? When he talked about Fidel's education system. And even though it's true, people don't want to hear it because they didn't just educate. They didn't just redistribute. They also incarcerated, executed, removed dissenting voices. They took away a lot of personal freedoms and liberty. Well, they were already living under a dictator. Now it's just a more communistic or socialistic dictator. And when the revolution was done in Cuba, Che wanted to spread it in Africa and then back in South America. And so from the United States perspective, this is like a class A terrorist, but from many of the poor and disenfranchised in South and Central or Latin America, he was seen as a hero. And same thing, Afghanistan. We can call the Taliban terrorist, but if you're part of the Taliban group, those are freedom fighters. And so perspective is a wild thing when we get into this concept of war. I was surprised that Augustine did not include, at least I'm not aware he included, what I believe is the greatest reason for a just war. And that is if God wills it. In fact, that became the rallying cry of the Crusades. Deus vult, God wills it. And the Muslims had a similar cry, Inshallah, God's will be done. It's part of what I'm so fascinated by the Crusades. I have a love-hate relationship with them. I'm horrified by the war and violence, but the faith, the passion, the devotion, you had two sides both believing God was on their side, and they were both fighting for holy ground. Same thing in the American Civil War. Both groups thought they had God on their side. America, to this present day, we believe God is on our side. One of my all-time favorite folk songs from the 60s was Bob Dylan's God on Our Side. And Google that or YouTube too, but if you've never heard that song, I think you'll enjoy it. The problem is, and George Bush actually pulled this one out in the Gulf War. He said God wanted him to engage. Now, whether God wanted George W. Bush to engage in intervention in Kuwait, I do not know. On a personal level, though, as a Christian, and remember, we're doing this in the context of Christian ethics, people who take the Bible as authoritative. And even though we have the Romans 13 passage where I am, as an American, under the authority of the President of the United States, I'm also an individual. And if he calls me to go to war because God told him to go to war, do you understand why, as an individual, I might need some personal, Jesus wants Fred to go to this war too? And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Where does personal freedom and integrity and being true to your convictions and to what you believe the Spirit's doing, how do we reconcile that with the scriptures that tell us we are under authority, and to obey them is to be like obeying God? And in Geisler, he gives us three options for this in that book I told you about, Christian Ethics. And Geisler's three views on this topic are an activist who is basically this mentality like, look, I'm an American. God has placed me in this country. If America calls me up to war, I'm going to go, just like if God called me up to war in Old Testament times. It's that same sort of thing. On the other end of the spectrum, Geisler gives us the pacifist. And he describes pacifists as those who don't believe in any sort of war at all. I think, once again, it wasn't a very robust definition of pacifism, and so let me fill it out for you a little bit. I don't particularly like the word pacifism because people confuse it with passive, and people assume pacifists are inactive or lackadaisical or they're checked out. You could be a very active pacifist. I prefer the term nonviolence to pacifism, and particularly non-physical, emotional, verbal, spiritual violence towards others. A pacifist might actually physically get in between an assaulter and their victim. I mean, they may be very engaged. They're simply not fighting violence with violence. They're not trying to overcome evil with evil. They're trying to overcome evil with good, as we saw in the last part of Romans 12. And then his third position is selectivist. And so the activist is my government, right or wrong, I'm obeying them like I would obey God. The pacifist is saying, I will obey to the degree I'm able, but I'm not going to do physical violence against another human. And then the middle position Geisler gives us is selectivist, where we have to use discernment, the scriptures, the Holy Spirit, Christian community to discern what wars are just and what are not just. Okay, so I'm assuming Geisler would suggest those living under Hitler and Nazi Germany, it would have been appropriate for them to say, no, I cannot participate in this war. Or perhaps an American cavalry officer being told to massacre a village of Native Americans. He would have needed to say, I cannot participate in this unjust command or action. Or in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. Could you say, this is an unlawful order, I refuse to obey? And so a selectivist is under the authority of another, but they're under the higher authority of God. And they would say, if this lower human or governmental authority, whether that's my parent, my pastor, my president, tells me to do something that is contrary to what I believe is the law or will of God, then we talked about this before, we need to submissively disobey. Remember, submission from Romans 13 is an absolute attitude of the heart, but obedience is conditional on what is being asked. Now, I think the activist position, like my country, right or wrong, I'm going to do it. I don't think I need to say anything more than the Nuremberg trials on that, where you had these Nazis simply saying, oh, I didn't have anything against the Jews or the gypsies or the homosexuals. I was just following order, as we gassed over 6 million people. And if you remember, that was not a defense that worked for them. These Nazis were still executed because they were the ones that carried out these heinous acts. And then on the pacifist end of the spectrum, I don't see it as you're either an activist or a pacifist. I see it more as a spectrum, and where some people are more inclined to engage in physical restraint or violence as a means to accomplishing an end, whereas the nonviolent end of pacifism is saying, no, we can stand up, we can speak, we can be standing in the breach, but we are not going to use violence to try to end violence, because all we're doing is perpetuating the violence. So discussion time. I'm curious where you guys land on these spectrums. I doubt if there's many my government right or wrong folks in here. Maybe there are. Probably most of you would fall in the selectivist group. And like I said, I don't see it as either you're a selectivist or a pacifist. I see it more of a continuum, where some people would be more inclined to, under great need or like defending your home or your family or your country, you might be willing to use physical violence to prevent atrocities or the horrors coming into you. And then some of you may be like, no, I just couldn't do that to another human being, even to save the things I love. The most extreme example I know of is Leo Tolstoy, who at least intellectually, philosophically, was like a complete pacifist, nonviolent, even to the point where he said, if if people broke into my home or my estate and threatened my wife and children, I would not use violence to try to stop them. Now, he might try to use his words or prayer or to be between the attackers and his family, but he's not going to pick up a pitchfork or a gun or a sword and use physical violence to protect his family. And that's being a parent and a man. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I'm sure women have very protective mama bear instincts too, but there seems something immoral about that, where you would just sit by and watch those under your care or provision suffer physical or emotional, spiritual harm when you could intervene. Now, I like the way the police recommend intervention right now. If you can diffuse a situation with a word, use the word. If it has to be a restraint, use a restraint. If it's to disable. The end result should be physical violence or killing another, right? It shouldn't be you're resisting arrest, I'm putting a bullet in your head. It's you're supposed to work through these steps. Same thing. You can't just shoot someone that comes into your home. You're supposed to use the least amount of violence or necessary to take care of the situation. So if you can say, hey, what are you doing here? Get out. If that works, you don't shoot them in the back as they're leaving. Using physical violence, whether a bat or a knife or a gun, should be the last resort because you fear your life is in imminent danger. So somewhere on the spectrum between selectivism and pacifism, I find it hard because there's plenty of passages, right, that tell us a man who doesn't care for his own family is worse than an infidel. I think not caring for their physical protection would be part of that. So how do we take this character and nature of God and through the Holy Spirit, this idea of we are to protect, we're to look out for, we're to defend, we're to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, we're to stand up for those who can't stand for themselves. But this idea of using physical violence to accomplish that creates all sorts of problems, especially when we go back to like the Sermon on the Mount. So Tolstoy, his idea is we have all these people engaged in physical violence who aren't even invested in what the issue is at hand. It's the bureaucrats, it's the kings, it's the princes, it's that 1% that is creating and profiting from the wars in the world. And yet the poor, the disenfranchised, the peasants, the serfs at the time Tolstoy's writing become complicit. And Tolstoy's view is not to attack and overthrow the government, but simply stop complying with the violence they're asking you to do. So, for example, the way the czars would control the population is they'd send out a troop, maybe an officer and a few soldiers to a village. So maybe you have 10 soldiers at a village of 300 people. And the officers would make their judgments, and then they would have the peasants beat fellow peasants as punishment. So they were actually enforcing their corporal and sometimes even capital punishments on the peasants, using the peasants to carry out the violence. What Tolstoy is saying is stop participating in the violence. If the government asks you to do violence to another, simply say, no, I'm not participating. Same thing. He greatly influenced Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi in India, he asked the question, how can 800,000 British soldiers control a subcontinent of almost 800 million people? And he says, it's because you're complicit with the oppressors. And so Gandhi advocated this non-violence, this non-participation in violence, not the overthrow, not the stabbing or assassinating the British soldiers, but stop participating in the violence they ask you to do. All right, I'm ready to hear some feedback or comments, questions.
Well, I have a question. I don't understand.
Do you see the tension we're holding here between the Sermon on the Mount, which tells us
between the what? Sorry.
You don't understand what?
No, my question was, doesn't this one like lack in practicality as well? Since if you're a soldier, let's say, and your superior tells you to be violent, I don't think you can just say no. right?
You would definitely come under some
You
kind
can
of
say no.
You can
Oh,
say no.
sorry.
retribution.
Sorry, go.
But
You
it-
can
it-
say no, but you'll get court-martialed.
It's just if you're willing to say no.
So you're saying no could actually cost you your own life.
Everything.
See, that's
And see, that
that-
we're kind of getting ahead of myself here, but this is where I think it's going to be a real ethical dilemma for Christians to be in the military, or could be, depending on what their convictions are. Now, if you're an activist, it's easy peasy, right? What a great place to be. You just do what you're told. You just obey. And it's this idea that, hey, I am going to be accountable to how well I obeyed. The person who commanded me will be accountable for what they commanded me. But I think that's self-deception. And you are accountable for what you do, regardless of whether someone else told you to do that or not.
I agree.
You can't
And
put that off on another. You're still the one pulling the trigger.
I agree, and that's why I would find it hard
Go
to
ahead,
do the military.
Daria.
Oh, sorry, there's a lag. I agree, and that's why I don't think I'm quite a perfect selectivist as you're describing, because let's say I was in the military, and even though at the very end, let's say someone ordered me to be directly violent, I think there's lots of other ways you could be indirectly violent and lead to such violence. You know, if I helped mechanic some of the gunships that were going down and like killing civilians or something like that, that's something I wouldn't agree with. So why would I help fix the plane or the boat or whatever? So I don't think I'm quite a selectivist, and that's why I don't think I could ever be in the military. Not this earthly one, anyway. I'm in a different one.
And see, that's a really good, right. And that's a good thing to know about yourself on the upfront. I mean, and it's part of why the military recruits people at such young ages. I mean, an 18, 19-year-old is probably going to have a very different response than a 30-year-old, right? Like a 30-year-old might be like, you want me to do what? And there might be more delay or a questioning. And this is part of why the military has to condition and enculturate.
Yes, and
I talked about this a little bit after our last class on punishment.
yeah.
Go ahead, Daria.
Also, another reason why I don't have the conviction to join the United States military is unfortunately just because of the track record, and not just with the United States, but most countries. You know, there's been a lot of selfish wars fought selfishly, and people died for what? Died for what I would consider not godly reasons. You know, we have a track record of that's not great in terms of why we fight wars and the people who get hurt in the crossfire.
Right. Oh, right. And that's a great getting down to the root. Even if you are a just war theorist, when you think of the recent conflicts the United States has been involved in, let's talk about the post 9/11. Was the wars we were engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan just wars? Were we defending ourselves from an invader, or were we intervening to protect the weak? And did we fight the Iraq and Afghanistan wars justly? Those are the two questions. And I don't think you have to agonize over this too much, because it's brutally clear why we were engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan. They weren't physically trying to invade the United States, right? It was after 9/11, and the Twin Towers, the trade towers in New York City, were struck by airplanes, and it was a war of retribution. It was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a blow for a blow, a life for a life. You knock down one of our towers, we're going to knock out one of your governments. 2 towers, 2 governments. Retribution. But do you see how appealing retribution is to the flesh and how contrary it is to the spirit? But it's so appealing. And I see that appeal in my own self. Some of my favorite movies. I love Braveheart. Braveheart isn't about freedom and constitutional or a democratic republic, or it's about revenge. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you, right? It's about this payback. And that really appeals to us. If you saw, Mel Gibson's really on a roll with those, right? With The Patriot, once again, where his character in the Patriot movie, he doesn't care about representation, no representation without taxation and having an independent country. They killed his son and he wants to kill them. It's that flesh, it's that wanting payback. It can be motivated by fear of the other, xenophobia, racism, prejudice, greed. And James tells us the causes of war. Whence comes wars amongst you? It's because we're at war with our own members. We are not at peace within ourselves with our own greed, our own hatred, our own want of vengeance and payback. And then we extrapolate that out to the national level. Valentina, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say that like exactly the way you make me think of it, it can't really be a just war, because anytime it includes a war in the first place, it's fighting violence with more violence. And so that's never really just, because you're saying like, and it happens so many times in so many different settings, you are fighting what you don't like with the same thing that you don't like, basically, so that can never be just, I think.
Right.
So when it comes to the
Thanks,
idea
Valentina.
of can you hear me? When
Yes.
it comes to the idea of divine
Good, Ethan.
mandate and divine favor, like you mentioned earlier, Bush saying that he felt like God wanted him to initiate the Gulf War.
Right.
Theologically, or even just ethically, when you take that idea of God, wills it, and presumably God wills it to victory, wouldn't that then turn into the idea of justice is the will of the stronger, and basically whoever wins the war was right? I mean that's the logical conclusion, but my question would be, if you believe in an all-powerful God, how can you not say that from a practical standpoint? And it's not pleasant, but is there actually any response to that within the idea of an all-powerful God?
Right. It kind of brings in the whole predestination or providence, right? Manifest destiny. And I'm, once again, theologically, philosophically, intellectually, I'm all on board. Deus Vult. If God commands it, we are to do it. If God says jump, we ask how high. If God says wipe out the Canaanites, we double check, do you mean every last one of them? If he says yes, that means yes.
If Jesus
My problem
says
is,
to
of
jump off
course,
a bridge,
you jump off the bridge, yes. Kate. Anyways, my concern is, do I know the difference between my own flesh, my own culture, my own conditioning from the voice of God and the Holy Spirit? And if I can't distinguish the two, then it's going to be a problem. I'm going to be susceptible to all sorts of other pressures, right? Like fear or intimidation or greed or lust, or these things that might motivate me, vengeance, to fight the other. And that's why I think it's really important to know thyself. And part of why I put up that video on meditations on the true self. Can you love your enemy, Sermon on the Mount, and kill them at the same time?
Right.
I actually had people in the military, Christians in the military, tell me with all sincerity, looking me straight in the eye, that they could. And I was stunned. But the more I thought about it, I think I could at least have an intellectual understanding about what they meant. That they had no personal malice or hatred or vengeance in their heart towards these other people. But because they were there representing their country and they were fighting for some sort of ideology, or maybe it was simply for their loved ones at home or the freedoms of America, or intervening in what these people were doing in an evil way towards other people. I could see how it was like, was it Saving Private Ryan, or I can't remember which movie, but there was a sniper in this movie where every time right before he took a kill shot, he would pray. And it was so creepy. But the more I thought about it, it was like, well, how else would you be a Christian in the military as a sniper, where you believe that's where God had called you, but you don't want to be full of hatred or bitterness or anger or malice, but you also have this job to do to protect the men in your company and, in a bigger scale, your very country back home. And could you send each bullet with a prayer for the soul of those you're dispatching? Or is that just complete psycho head trip mentalness?
Allahu Akbar.
Killing people in the name of God.
Same.
Right.
Same thing.
It's the whole crusade mentality.
I think my answer to the idea of justice being the will of the stronger, and, you know, if God didn't want me to win, then he wouldn't let it happen, is, even if that does work on a practical, cosmological level, when you do that, you are essentially saying, all right, God, I'm going to do whatever I want, and if you want to stop me, you're going to have to take some very direct action and essentially kill me. So it's not wrong from a logical perspective, but you are putting yourself right under the heat of God's justice, rather than submitting yourself to a justice system, you know, on Earth. So it's just a very risky endeavor.
And I know that sounds shocking, what you're rolling out there, Ethan, but that's actually how I think I roll, especially when I've used all the other tools I believe God's given me. I've done my point, counterpoint. I've looked at the scriptures. I've looked at both sides. I've seen the logical conclusions. And oftentimes, I stalemate myself in my own mind. And I want to be yielded to the Spirit. And sometimes, hopefully in all sincerity, I basically say, God, I'm at a stalemate here between like a just and unjust war, lawful intervention, a godly intervention, and one that's of the flesh. And I honestly don't know what to do. And I would simply tell God I'm going to do the best I can with the light given me, and then ask for his mercy and providence, that he will be glorified and bring good out of, even if I make a bad decision. But I'm not trying to use that as a cop-out or excuse not to do the work, not to do the research, not to wrestle with your own conscience or your country's policies. But sometimes we don't know. And sometimes the government has information not available to me, right? Bush obviously knew a lot of stuff Fred Blackburn did not know about the invasion of Kuwait. And am I willing to let go of my own rights, my own ego, my own pride, my own knowledge, and be submissive to those in authority over me? And I am willing to a degree, except when that authority that asks me to do something, like to take another life. And that's where I personally would have to respectfully say, I submit to your authority, but I cannot obey this particular action. Now, that may mean my incarceration. I might have to go to Canada. I might have to do other things, but it's not out of cowardice or fear. It's out of obedience to how I believe God wants me to live. Now, Maura and I were talking. Maura was in the military. Are you still in the military, Maura, or are you out now?
Nope, still in.
Okay. So Maura and I were talking about the unique, not just talking about war in particular, but even being in the military in general as a Christian, and some of the unique problems that may cause, especially if you're being asked to do something unlawful. Maura and I both talked about how the ethics, if you've ever looked at the ethics codes in the military, the different branches of the military, they're quite robust, and they're trying to deal with, the difference between a lawful and an unlawful order. You're required to obey a lawful order, not an unlawful order. But like Maura pointed out, on the battlefield or some situation, if you disobey an order, you could be field court-martialed. You may not even get a chance to come back and plead your case and explain why you disobeyed. Maura, do you want to weigh in on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's the UCMJ, which is the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and there's certain obligations that you have to abide by. But like you said, if you disagree, I think that, to be honest, things have gotten better over time with as far as like representation of this person standing up and saying, no, I'm not gonna, complete that order. I'm not gonna fulfill, my position in this. And to the point where, there's been so many court cases. I mean, I follow up on a lot, and it's hard, because you took the oath, to obey any order given by the United States president. So it's difficult, but like I said, things have gotten better to the point where you can say no, and the risk of being court-martialed is a little bit less than it was, during World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and all of those wars, and
right.
It just, it makes you think,
Okay. Well, I do want to wrap this up because I want to get to civil disobedience and knock that out too. So in summary, let me put it this way. I think activism is flat out. And once again, I think Geisler's using it to make his selectivists look more balanced. And pacifism, I think he misrepresents. And that is like this passive, you're basically a doormat. You get walked over. You're not protecting those under your care. And so he's dealing with selectivism. But once again, I would see selectivism as a continuum, almost from the activist side to the pacifist nonviolent side. And most of us are somewhere in between. I would see myself as maybe a 97, 98% physical pacifist. Obviously, I'm not quite so passive with my ideas. I'm trying not to do psychological or philosophic violence towards others, but it's hard sometimes, and that's where I need to work and submit to the spirit and not the flesh. But as far as physical violence go, I do not see that as a solution. It would be like the last of last resorts. And even then, I'm afraid of, would I be in the spirit, or would the flesh or my animal fight or flight instincts kick in? And I want to be in the spirit, regardless of what it has to do. Now, I have both activist and pacifist friends, and some of my pacifist friends are much like Tolstoy, where they don't believe there's any time for physical violence. And I don't know, they would go so far to say they do not believe you could be a Christian and be in the military, or at least a Christian in right fellowship or standing with God. You'd be like a carnal Christian if you were in the military. And quite frankly, I don't see that. Even though I see myself as a very far-in pacifist, I'm not going to tell other people that they're not a Christian or not in the spirit because they happen to be in the military. And part of that is our examples. When Christ healed the centurion's daughter, he didn't say, now quit the Roman military, go and sin no more. Or the same situation with Paul healing the centurion's daughter. It's just this idea of, or bringing the gospel to the centurion's house. He didn't say, you have to, now that you're a Christian, resign your commission. The injunction was to now fulfill your commission as a military officer in a righteous and holy way, where you don't use your power and authority to extort or abuse or control others in a negative way, but you're using it as like a protector, right? Almost like a shepherd of the people. Instead of using the military for violence and oppression, you're using it for protection. And Maura and I were talking about this, how important it is to have Christians in all aspects of life, whether that's education, in the auto shop, or in the military. I want Christians in the military. I want the salt and light, but I want them to be in the spirit and not of the flesh. And that's what I want you to be aware of. If you're looking at the military as a career, I have a problem with that, because the career is, they're literally teaching you how to kill. That becomes your profession. Now, it's not just like a professional killer per se, but it's you're using violence in that military sense to keep the Pax Americana, or the American vision of how the world should be. And do you have enough character as a Christian to be in the American military, or any military for that matter, and to then be able to say, I submissively cannot fulfill this order because it violates my conscience? Say, take the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, for example, where out of fear and xenophobia, this Vietnamese village was massacred. Now, was there just cause and all that? Had civilians been putting grenades in baskets and helicopters as they landed to drop off supplies or take out the wounded? Yeah, there was a lot of fear, a lot of reasons to turn on a village, right? An innocent village. But there were women and children, old people just gunned down. And do you have the character, or like, let's take Fallujah in Iraq, where Iraqi prisoners were being tortured and humiliated by American soldiers. Could you be a Christian in that place and confront your commanding officers and your fellow military members and say, we are not those kind of people. We are not doing these things. And if it means me being kicked out or court-martialed or whatever, I am not going along with this. I want that kind of salt and light. Any comments, questions? Let me close on this then. Maura and I also talked about when veterans come back, they're changed. There's something that happens in the military. And remember, for the most part, we're brought up in America in a Judeo-Christian sort of mores and values about how we don't use violence. We're not cruel. We're not mean. We certainly don't kill other human beings. And so part of what the military has to do to train people to kill other human beings is there's an indoctrination process that goes on. It's like it's us versus them mentality. In fact, we even have the subculture of the military and its different branches in our society. And if you're not from a military family or background, if you're civilian, you're other, right? You're suspect. You don't get it. You don't understand. But in that military bubble, there can also be these really interesting justifications for that lifestyle, for the use of violence, for the use of war. I guess my problem is when we indoctrinate and enculture people, because if we're told not to kill, we have to dehumanize the other to some degree. I remember hearing Marine chants like "kill a commie for your mommy," or we talk about the evil Hun, right? Or camel jockeys, or infidels, and we come up with these degrading terms that are used, gooks and chinks and all that sort of stuff. People still use that language today, but it shows that kind of xenophobia, that prejudice where we vilify, we dehumanize the other, that enables us to actually kill them. But how you turn that switch off, right? How do you then come back and you're working as a checkout guy or gal at Walmart and some punk kid's mouthing off to you? How do you switch that? How do you put that switch back to, no, I'm not allowed to just headbutt them in the line or to whatever? And this is a problem. We have a lot of veterans. It's not so much what happened to them, although those are certainly problems, especially physically, but they also have to deal with what they did to others. And what does that do to your soul? And how do you how do you live with that? Going and suspending your traditional ethics and mores. You live as a soldier in the military. You may be expected or required to kill, and then now you're supposed to come back as a civilian and go right back into that way you were before. And you see why there is a lot of depression, a lot of PTSD, a lot of struggle, even suicide, high suicide rates among our veterans. And Maura, would you address that a little bit? I know this is a passion for you.
Yeah, I want to say suicide is probably one of the biggest things that we are fighting against. And I think that when you say, you want Christians in the military, I find that this is so true because, I feel like of all the people that I've met, if you don't stand for anything, you know what I mean? Like if you don't believe in anything, you don't stand for anything, you know what I mean? And it's almost like to the suicide rate increased dramatically up to 60%. And I was just recently on deployment and we had over 8 suicide attempts in a period of 3 months. And we had 3 that actually committed suicide. And it was so devastating. And these are my brothers and my sisters in arms. And it's just like, no, there's a way out. And it goes back to what you talked about before, walking and abiding, and then walking in the Spirit, striving, abiding. And it's so sad. It's just so sad to see, and that affects other people. And then you have this, well, how do I get out of this? Or what is my way? Or they don't know the Lord. They don't know Christ. They don't know anything. And their only outlet is, I'm going to kill myself. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And it's just, I feel that having that servant leadership and showing them the gospel and showing them, the word, I've seen so many people change over deployments, or even just in units, find God, and they're completely changed. And it's so amazing to see that, but it's so sad to see those who are lost and, and their only way out is suicide. And it was at 20%, then it jumped to 40, and then just last year it was up to 60%. And I was close to one female.
What are you talking about?
Suicide.
The rates went up 60%?
60%.
The suicide rates went up 60%?
60%, yes. And it's just, it's Air Force wide. Even
we're not saying 60% of the military are trying to kill themselves. We're saying the suicide rates have gone up 60%. I was kind of tripping out in my head a second.
No,
that's so awful.
Yes, yeah. So we actually created
okay.
Air Force.
Maura,
Air Force, I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna. Okay, I just want to end this because I have 10 minutes. I just want to at least show how civil disobedience connects to capital punishment war as well.
Okay. Yeah, of course.
The last thing I want to say about this, on my other end of the spectrum, I have my pacifist friends who, like I said, they don't believe you can be a Christian and be in the military, which I think is another ditch you can reckon. When we talk about what it is to be a Christian, your profession isn't what determines, it's whether you're indwelt by the Holy Spirit, right? And for my pacifist friends, I don't know what they're going to do, what they do with Revelation. When Jesus comes back, he's not coming back as a gentle reed. He's coming back as the warrior king with a sword, and for judgment and wrath and punishment. And it talks about the saints riding with him, right? Are my pacifist friends going to say, I'm sorry, Jesus, I'm a pacifist. I'm not. I don't know. Or maybe they see that in a different dispensation. And right now we're in the dispensation of grace. We have the imagery, right, of Paul putting on the whole armor of God. We have the famous hymn of Onward Christian Soldiers. But please do not be confused. Paul, and hopefully that hymn, we're talking, it's like in Islam as well, with this idea of jihad or holy war. There's a greater jihad and a lesser jihad. There's a greater spiritual warfare and a lesser. The lesser jihad is fighting against the infidels, right? People that don't believe. And I don't think that's appropriate from a religious or Christian point of view, period. The spiritual warfare we're talking about, the whole putting on the armor of God, we're fighting against the flesh, right? It's the flesh against the spirit. It's this internal conflict. That's where we should not be pacifist. That's where we should go for the jugular. We need to reckon that flesh dead and in the grave. And that's important. So those are my takes on war. And you can see that the spectrum within Christianity, once again, weird phenomena. We tend to have progressive, liberal, secular humanists advocating for peace, and conservative Christians more on the hawk end of the spectrum. And that just kind of boggles my Christian mind. I don't understand it. Okay, let's have a pause, and then I'm going to give you real quickly civil disobedience. All right. Sorry, I should have made this a whole new video, but I'm just going to tack it on to war, since we're using the similar proof text of Matthew 5 versus Romans 13. And once again, I'm going to use Geisler again. I like how he breaks them up into these triads. So for civil disobedience, which is obeying the authority over you, he talks about the radical patriot, who our government's like our parent, and our job is to obey. The government is accountable, or the authority is accountable to God. We're accountable to obeying the authority over us, per Romans 13. The other end of the spectrum, he has anarchy, where you're not the boss of me, don't tell me what to do. So an anarchist is someone who only believes in their own internal authority. And you might say, well, how could you have a Christian anarchist? Easily. In fact, the dead have no need of ethics you can imagine could lead towards a certain type of Christian anarchy, where if the Spirit is telling you to do something, and that Spirit is within you, knit together with your spirit, that's kind of like an internal authority. Even though we could talk about God being external, it's also kind of internal for the case of those who are knit together with Christ. And if you have the very authority and power of God within you, why should you have to listen to the government or your parents or your teacher or the president? Or you have God himself telling you what to do. So it's a weird sort of almost like early monastic hermetic anarchy. In fact, some of the early hermits, desert fathers, were called spiritual anarchists because they were just kind of like these antinomians. They were outlaws. They were outside the authority of the church, of even the scriptures at times. Kind of like the Sufis in Islam, where the Sharia is for the common people, but those who know Allah have a different relationship. So we have those two extremes. Radical patriot, you're not even thinking for yourself. You're just like an extension or automaton of the state. And the anarchist, who is all about the self and no one else gets to tell you what to do, with the exception of God for the Christian anarchist. Okay. Now Geisler gives us two middle positions, and these are mouthy, and I type them on the whiteboard, but it's been glitchy on me, so I'll say them slowly. We have the anti-compulsionist and the anti-promulgationalist. So radical patriot, anarchist, and then we have these two positions in the middle, and which is kind of an interesting gradation Geisler does. So an anti-compulsionist is someone who says we need to submit to and obey the government unless they compel us to do evil. So for example, in the 70s, there was this movie that came out called ZPG, Zero Population Growth. And the government put like a 10-year moratorium on childbearing. So everyone was supposed to use birth control, or if you got pregnant, to have an abortion in this 10-year period to try to get a handle on the population control in the sci-fi movie. So it became a thing. Now, an anti-compulsionist would say, at that point, you need to disobey the government. Because if you believe that God wants you to have children and that terminating a pregnancy is killing an unborn child, you simply would still want to be submissive, right? In the sense of, I must submissively disobey. You can't compel me to abort my child against my conscience or what I believe God wants me to do. The other view, anti-promulgationalist, is where the government promotes evil. It doesn't compel it, but it promotes it. In other words, if there was government funding for abortions with Planned Parenthood, that would be a promotion of evil. If you view the government taking prayer out of school as promoting secular humanism and taking God out of our schools, that would be the government promoting evil. Interestingly enough, even some very prominent Christian philosophers, apologists, take this view, like Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer believed that when prayer was taken out of the American schools, the American government lost its authority, its divine mandate from heaven. And its citizens no longer were under their authority, which means we don't have to pay taxes, we don't have to follow the laws, we don't have to do the census, and we'll pray when and where we feel like it. That's wild to me, this idea that if the government promotes it, like in China, not this idea that if you get pregnant, you have to have an abortion, but trying to get a handle on population in China, they had a one-child policy, especially in urban areas. The more you moved out to the country, you could have more children without penalty. But in the cities and urban areas, they may not require you to abort if you have more than one child, but it may mean you're not going to get that promotion. There may be penalties or liabilities. It may affect your retirement, privilege status, those sorts of things. So you could see it as more of a promotion than a compelling in like that sci-fi movie. In addition to all of these, Geisler then says there are active forms of civil disobedience and passive forms. So passive forms would be like not paying your taxes because you don't want your money to go to wars or thermonuclear warheads or building a border wall or whatever your particular put-offedness is with the government. And so you're simply not going to support them with your resources. Another might be to do like a sit-in, where you simply do not comply, or a refusal to disperse. Although now we're getting more towards a physical, even though you're not physically punching someone, there is a physicality to like a sit-in or surrounding an abortion clinic and locking arms and not moving, right? You're not punching anyone. You're not yelling bad names or something at the women trying to come in to have an abortion or the doctors or nurses assisting, but you're preventing them physically from doing that. And so we're kind of moving more towards the active. An active civil disobedient person might be someone who says, hey, if the government's violated the Constitution or our rights, have they right as citizens and Christians to overthrow the government? And America is in a unique position that way, right? The way our government was founded, the rights and privileges we have. And so some Christians actually believe the government has forfeited its right because of its engagement in non-biblical practices or policies. It's curious because this has actually come up with this coronavirus quarantine and pandemic, where many of the people protesting against the quarantine and the stay-at-home orders are people that would associate with conservative Christianity. And I find this really fascinating. And I would be curious people who are protesting the stay-at-home orders and things like that on grounds of our civil liberties, how they reconcile that with, say, Romans 13, where we're supposed to be submissive to the laws given to us. Would anyone like to comment on that? Now, as far as I know, these are passive protests, right? They might be blocking traffic or roadways or things of that nature. But usually these are people gathering in cars or maybe in groups to protest the lockdown or the restriction of movement or not being able to work. So how do we navigate something like this as a Christian? How do we submit to authority, but at the same time, live in the freedom that we have in Christ? Or in this case, the freedoms we have as being American citizens given to us in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution. Questions, comments?
I think we talked about
Curiously
it before.
enough, Geisler and I... Oh, go ahead, Daria.
Oh, I was saying because you were asking about in terms of the protest going on right now. I mean, I don't even think that the whole protest aligns with, the greatest commandments. But I mean, I don't know if they're Christian or not. That's not up to me. And if they're not, well, then they're not under those rules. But, as a Christian, it says love God and love others
I'm just
like
concerned
yourself.
about Christian civil disobedience right now.
Oh, just in general?
What would be some of the justifications? Christian civil disobedience for, say, like the pandemic. Like, we're going to go to church. We don't care what the government says. We're commanded to not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, and we'll try to be safe about it, but we're going to go with our guidelines, not your guidelines. Is that a legitimate Christian response, or is that putting your own will above the authority that God has placed over you?
I think that... where'd my words go? But I think it's legalistic to say that, we have to meet and to place that above the authority above you. Plus, it's selfish. You're putting your own wants and desires above the well-being of others, potentially. I don't think it follows the first two commandments, personally.
Okay. I can certainly see we could call it selfish. Like, come on, think about the collective, right? It's not just about egoism or your own rights or you and Jesus. It's about society. We're living in this. What about the social hedonism piece? What about the well-being of the old and the weakest among us? And our freedoms could actually hurt them. And so you can see that tension, right? Mm-hmm. But you could see Christians also arguing, look, if we don't stand up and protect and defend these rights that God has given us living in this country, if we let the government little by little take them away, the next thing we know, we may not even be able to worship when there is no pandemic because a precedent has been set. And maybe they'll use this as an excuse so we can't assemble, so we can't bear arms, so we can't defend our freedoms. And so you can see very strong coming from the Christian right of why we need to defend our civil liberties, but they have to deal with Romans 13 at some level.
I was just going to say, what about the cost? Like, for example, the pastor that defied social distancing, and then he died right after contracting COVID-19.
He did.
Yeah.
Sure. But he died for his principles, right?
Right.
He died for, he believed he was fighting for freedom.
But who else did he infect? Who else did he infect before he died? Because there was I think there was an article out saying that he actually infected 5 or 6 other people within that community because he defied the social distancing laws.
But he didn't make those people show up. They made their choice. They exercised their freedom, right? He didn't kill them.
Right.
Ethan, I wanted to
Okay.
hear from you.
I was just going to say, I think that is how you really resolve the idea of Christian liberty with submission to earthly authority. Is, yeah, you can exercise your liberty and freedom according to your conscience, but you also have to submit to the consequences. So even if you're exercising civil disobedience, whether that's in peaceful protest or actively disobeying the law, you at the very least as a Christian have to own up to the consequences of that, whether that's being, imprisoned or, fined. And if that's fine with you, then, go for it. But don't complain when you get arrested.
Yeah. Also, I think it's a matter
No, I like that,
of
Ethan.
perspective.
Daria, let me just rant for a minute.
Oh, go for it.
I really appreciate that, Ethan. I love that personal responsibility piece. Not playing the victim card, not I'm being oppressed or persecuted, but hey, this is important to me. This is a right. And if it means I'm going to get fined or I might get sick and die or these other things, I'm willing to do that for what I believe is important. On the same, and this is where I think that piece about not judging others comes in too. There are Christians out there who really are concerned of this isn't just because of the pandemic, but this is the long game, right? Of the deep state or people trying to take away our Christian heritage or our Christian rights and privileges. And they're genuinely concerned. And even if I don't share their concerns, at least not yet, I don't get to judge them. I don't get to call them wackadoodles and all that. Now, we can point out, like, could you see how this might be selfish or you're endangering other people? We can show them our concerns, but they're really accountable to God. And what I want, though, and whether you believe we should be civilly disobedient at this time, or whether you're going to comply with the government stay-at-home orders, it still needs to be done in love. It has to be done submissively. We shouldn't be out there railing hate and demonizing people that disagree with us and vilifying the people in authority. Remember, we're to pray for them, regardless if you like Trump or Gavin Newsom, Pelosi or Bernie. It doesn't matter. When people have put when God has put authority over us, we are to pray for them. It doesn't mean we have to necessarily respect or agree with what any of those people say, but we are respecting that place and authority and office God has given. Remember, honor to whom honor is due. Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give unto the Lord what belongs to the Lord. We can live in this way, but our ultimate authority is God, but the civil authorities need to be respected. I personally, but this is my personal conviction, unless they ask me to violate a direct command of God. Them telling me to stay at home for this period of time, it may be violation of my right to assemble or freedom of movement, but we are under a national emergency. Now, 6 months, a year from now, if that's still the case, I may be willing to join you passively in the streets talking about freedom of movement and certain privileges I want for all humans, not just Americans. But for right now, during a state of emergency, I'm willing to let go some of my rights and privileges, either from God or from being an American, because one, my obedience to the authority over me, and then my care and compassion to those that I might harm by free ranging. But that's my conviction. That's my belief. Those that are protesting or want to have churches in parking lots, it's okay. But do you see how it has to be done in submission? Even if you disobey, the attitude has to be of submission, and it needs to be done out of love, not out of this wrath, malice, anger. And there you need to look at the fruit of the Spirit and the work of the flesh. Can you protest or disobey in the Spirit? I believe you can. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, tons of examples. Paul, right, in the prison cell. there's lots of ways we can lovingly not comply with what we believe is evil. And I believe you can
stoning of
even
Stephen,
passively protest. Yes.
Yeah, he didn't throw the stones back.
All right.
He accepted his punishment under Jewish law, but he also didn't recount his faith.
Right. Do you see the difference between that posturing and someone railing at the government, right? You know, they got their Bible in one hand and their AK-47 in the other. And it's just like, what kind of message are we sending? What are we showing about the state of our heart?
Yeah. One thing I think we need to keep in mind is that, you know, the stay-at-home order, it's a matter of perspective. They're telling you, you know, you should not meet, and some people see that as oppression, but really I see it as, listen, you're not going to want to meet, because if you do, you won't have a congregation to meet with. I see it as a protection so that you can meet later. Because if you gather now, right, they're saying, like, if you gather now, you can spread a virus that will kill each other, and you won't have the congregation you once had. So I see it as a protection rather than an oppression.
But you can at least see the concern. I won't call it fear. I think it's fear, but you can see the concern of people who are like, no, this is just an excuse for the government to take away our rights and eventually our religion and our God. It's just, I would call that borrowing trouble.
Yeah. I can see why they're scared.
Yeah. That could happen, but I don't think that's the case at the moment. All right, let me just close with this. This one kind of surprised me because Geisler and I usually don't come to the same conclusion, but we actually agree on this one. So at least according to his terms, Geisler and I would both be anti-compulsionist, passive, civil disobedient people. And what all that big words means is I'm going to submit to the government and even obey them unless the government compels me to do evil, what I believe is in direct violation against the law of God. And in that case, I'm going with the law of God over the law of my government. But if and when I have to disobey the government because of my conscience, I need to do it in a spirit-filled, peaceful way. Not, come and pry my gun from my cold dead hand, you fascist commies or whatever. No, I'm to have the mind of Christ and to realize that's where my freedom is. That's where my security is. That's where my justice is. All right. Thank you, guys.